Yeah, but I want. There we are. I can there.
Oh, you can do that. Yeah,
yeah. Alright, good. So now I need to share that then. So.
Search for it. Usually works. Search. You scroll down. Just scroll down. Come back home. Scroll down. Type in.
Is
that going to matter?
No, that's fine. So now I want to share that to Lewes Present. Lewes Present start. So you can watch it on there. You turn your volume down on that so it's not feeding back. So that's on Lewes Present now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's on Lewes Present now, I think.
Yep. So there we go. So let me just type on here.
See what you want. I'll log out.
Well done, thank you.
I'll log out of you on you.
Well,
do you want me to stay
because I can Facebook, I can use Facebook for all this.
That's fine.
That makes it just for a moment.
That's fine.
Right. Okay. This is the Climate Hustings live from Priory School. No, because what I can do now is I can just... Can I just take a photograph? How would you? I'm going to close that out. And then cancel, you want to stay in the party. Oh, but then they won't get it. Sure.
Hello and good evening. I hope you can hear me, but I doubt if you can. No. Is this working? Good. I've been given two conflicting sets of instructions tonight. One is that time is crucial. The second is we have to start 5 minutes late because this is Lewes. So I'm trying to do both at once. My name is Alex Kirby. I'm a retired environment journalist. I work now on a website with 3 other retired environment journalists. It's sort of displacement activity to give us something to get up for in the morning. First things first. Fire escapes. I think you can probably see where they are, generally the ones with lights. So everyone make a beeline for that corner if there's an emergency, and good luck. Second, pretty well as important, toilets. If you want one, go out through the doors there and ask a steward. I think that's that. Third, please, if you have a mobile with you, will you make sure that either it's off or that it's on silent mode. Otherwise, someone is in for embarrassment. Next, the timetable. It probably helps if you know where, I hope it helps, if you know what we're in for tonight. First of all, we're going to have a presentation in around about 10 minutes from Dr. Martin Meadows, a Lewes resident. I'll tell you now something about him and what he's going to be talking about. Martin's a scientist who's spent his career working in the environment, climate and energy fields in research, the private sector and government. As a civil servant, Martin worked on climate and energy policy. He was a government delegate to the IPCC and to the UN climate negotiations. He's now no longer a civil servant, but works in the music business. But he says he keeps up with the latest developments on climate science and policy. What he's going to be talking about is really hard science. Loss of species, biodiversity, agribusiness, and of course, climate change itself. After Martin has finished, we will then have the 5 speakers, 4 candidates and someone who's kindly filling in for another of them. They will join us on the platform here. And then I will ask each of them the same question. I'll tell you what the question is when we get to it. They will have a very limited time to answer it, because brevity is one of the keynotes of tonight. So they will have 4 minutes each, and if they go on, I shall interfere. So I hope they won't. I'm sure they won't. After that, we're going to have a number of questions that have been sent in advance, which are going to be read for us. I'll explain why I'm not reading them and they are, and why our readers, Katie and Tanu, are reading them for us. That will take nearly an hour. Then we shall have half an hour for questions from the floor with a roving mic. We shall then have brief questions, brief statements from the speakers, and then we will close. And we have to close by 9:45 sharp. And we will do. If people want to go on talking informally afterwards, of course, that's a different matter. But we will close, certainly the formal part of the meeting, at 9:45. I hope that's okay with everyone and intelligible. And if I can just give you 4 words, which I hope are going to mark this evening. This evening is about generating light without adding to the amount of heat there is. At least I think that's roughly it. And the keynotes I have in mind for it, and I hope you share them, are that we should all of us aim to be brief, we should aim to be focused, we want to be practical, and we will show respect to one another It's possible you may disagree with other people here, but you don't have to be quarrelsome about it. None of us do. Okay, Martin, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. The Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. July this year was the hottest month ever recorded. Average global temperatures have risen by 1 degree centigrade in the last 100 years. Human activity has been responsible for all of the warming for the past 70 years. Additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, mainly from fossil fuel combustion, is responsible for about 80% of the Earth's warming. Other greenhouse gases resulting from human activity, such as methane, nitrous oxide, and a few other gases, make up the rest of the warming. On current emissions trends, the world will be 3 to 4 degrees warmer by the end of this century. If that increase happens, the world will be a different place to the one that hosts our current civilization. The warming is not spread evenly. 20 to 40% of the global population has already experienced in the decade 2005 to 2015 warming greater than 1.5 degrees, 2 to 3 times higher than that in some regions. The northernmost parts of the planet are warming the fastest, with the Arctic already experiencing temperatures of 4 degrees or more above the long-term average. The effects of this warming are already evident. Climate change is harming people and destroying the prospects for millions of people, particularly people living in countries with low incomes. Heating of the atmosphere and the oceans is exacerbating extreme weather such as heat waves and flooding, melting the Arctic ice sheets and glaciers and causing sea level rise and droughts. Changes to rain patterns are disrupting agriculture and creating water shortages. Many parts of the world are suffering record wildfires, storms, cyclones and hurricanes, and coral, which forms the foundation for much of the food in the seas, is dying. There is a second related crisis. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinction is accelerating, with grave impacts on ecosystems and people around the world. 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and climate change is an important factor in this crisis of nature. Recognising the harm to humans and ecosystems already resulting from warming of 1 degree, and the potential of much greater harm if warming trends continue, nearly every country in the world agreed in Paris in 2015 to work collectively to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and make efforts to halt warming at 1.5 degrees. But remember, 1.5 degrees is not a safe level of warming. There is already serious harm to people and nature at current warming of 1 degree. Every fraction of a degree increase causes more harm. So 5 years have passed since the Paris Agreement. What's happened since? The World Meteorological Organization published last week its latest assessment of the atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases. Scientists agree that carbon dioxide concentrations need to stabilise at about 1990 levels, that's 350 parts per million, to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But there is no sign of a slowdown, let alone decline. Concentrations reached 415 parts per million this year. On current trends, the world will pass 1.5 degrees warming between 2030 and 2052. Now turning to the main sources of carbon dioxide. This chart shows global energy use from 1960 to 2017 and the sources of that energy. High carbon emitting fuels, coal, oil and gas, continue to dominate energy supply and are outgrowing the growth in renewables. The trend in oil and gas is strongly upwards. 80% of the world's energy is provided by fossil fuels. Consequently, global emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels are continuing historical trends with no sign of a peak. At the same time, the world's energy needs are projected to grow by approximately 30% by 2040. The United Nations last week published its assessment of progress to curb emissions. The UN warns that unless global greenhouse gas emissions peak in 2020 and then fall by 8% each year between 2020 and 2030, the world will miss the opportunity to get on track towards the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Put another way, at current rates of emissions, in 8 years from now, the world will have emitted enough carbon dioxide to exceed 1.5 degrees warming. The window of opportunity is fast closing. And what's happening in reality? A study published in the periodical Nature this year concluded that the world already has too many fossil fuel power plants to meet climate goals. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, not only must no new fossil fueled infrastructure be built ever again, some existing power plants need to shut down early. And yet today, many new plants are under construction or planned around the world. And as for oil, analysis published in September this year by Carbon Tracker found that no major oil company is acting accordingly with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's not just corporations investing in fossil fuels. Global subsidies for fossil fuels amounted to $5.2 trillion in 2017. That's around 1/15 of the measured global economy. And the UK is the largest financial supporter of fossil fuels in the European Union. So clearly there is a gap between words and action on climate. And now I'll focus on the United Kingdom. Emissions of greenhouse gases from the UK have reduced by 44% since 1990. That's a strong performance. But that estimate does not include emissions from international aviation and shipping, or the carbon emitted from the manufacture and transport of the stuff we import. Taking account of these sources, the UK's actual carbon footprint has fallen by about 10% since 1997. The UK is not alone in having trouble reducing its carbon footprint. The carbon footprint of countries often considered to be green progressives like Sweden and Denmark has also remained about the same for the last few decades. Earlier this year, the UK became the first country to legislate for net zero carbon greenhouse gas emissions. Whilst a step up in ambition from previous legislation, the target date of 2050 and actual policies on the ground fall short of action needed to be consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The target is also ill-defined by the addition of net to zero carbon. The term net implies continued emissions of greenhouse gases while using unspecified techniques and as yet unavailable technologies to vacuum huge quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Earlier this year, the government's independent advisors on climate change marked the government's score sheet based on the previous, less stringent 80% cut in emissions by 2050 and concluded that, quote, UK action to curb greenhouse gas emissions is lagging behind what is needed to meet legally binding emissions targets. Since June 9, 2018, government has delivered only one of 25 critical policies needed to get emissions reductions back on track. So what in reality needs to happen to drastically reduce our emissions anywhere near the rate of levels needed? Professor Kevin Anderson at Manchester University has calculated that to comply fully with the goals of the Paris Agreement, the UK must 1. Rapidly ramp up action to cut emissions by 13% per year. 2. Reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the energy system by 80% compared to 1990 by 2030. And 3. Fully decarbonise the energy system by 2035 to 2040. What needs to change to fully decarbonise our energy system? This chart shows the proportion of different sources contributing to the UK's energy consumption in 2018. The black and grey sectors produce carbon dioxide. The purple sector is low carbon. Oil provides 36% of our energy needs, mainly for transport. Gas provides 40% of our energy needs, mainly heating our homes and other buildings, and for generating electricity. Coal, used to generate electricity, is in decline and will soon be eliminated. Bioenergy, mainly burning wood chips in power stations, has replaced some of the coal, but burning wood emits carbon dioxide, and I haven't included that in the low carbon category. The purple sector contains the low carbon sources of electricity. In the purple sector in 2018, nuclear energy provided around 7%, wind energy about 3%, solar energy about 1%, and hydro about 0.2% of the country's energy use. So to be compliant with our climate ambitions, we must grow the purple sector of low-carbon electricity and eliminate the black and grey sectors by 2040 at the latest. And to do these things, we must rapidly, 1, decrease the amount of energy we use, that is, become more energy efficient, particularly energy used for heating buildings and transport. And 2, dramatically increase the quantity of low-carbon energy supply. Historic rates of decarbonisation won't be anywhere near sufficient. There must be a step change. And finally, this chart shows the proportion of energy used by different sectors of the economy. Transport consumes the largest proportion at 40%. Heating our homes and other uses of energy at home use nearly 30% of the total. Services such as shops, education, healthcare and other businesses and industry, mainly making stuff, share the remaining 30% or so. If we're to make big inroads on carbon dioxide emissions, then the way we provide energy for transport and our homes and the amount of energy they use is a priority. And now to wrap up. The world has warmed by 1 degree Celsius in the last 100 years. The chance to remain below 1.5 degrees is receding, but it is still possible. Global emissions need to peak now and then reduce rapidly and dramatically. Emissions are, however, currently increasing with no sign of a peak. We don't have techniques or technologies to vacuum up carbon dioxide at the planetary scale that will be needed if current trends continue. As for the UK, nearly 90% of our energy use is met from sources that emit carbon dioxide. To meet its climate goals, the UK needs to rapidly transform how much energy it uses, the way it heats its homes, its transport and electricity supply within 20 years. And lastly, I haven't had time to cover the other crucial part of the story, and that is adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change and ensuring communities are resilient and prepared for what is to come. Hopefully that important aspect will also be covered in the discussion this evening. The science is clear and unequivocal, and has been for many decades. The world has had plenty of warning and time to adjust. The technologies already exist to sufficiently cut carbon dioxide emissions, but the world, particularly the high carbon emitting, high income part of the world, is yet to act meaningfully. So now over to our candidates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. When it comes to climate change, you're one of the best informed musicians I've met. I'd like now to invite the speakers, the 4 candidates, and someone else who is speaking with them tonight, to come up and join us on the platform. It doesn't matter where you sit, so long as it's at that end. Welcome back. Right, what we're going to do in this session is ask the candidates by surname, by order of surname, to answer the question I've got for them. I don't know if you know what it is yet, but you will in a minute or two anyway. At the far end is Nancy Bixon, who is not a candidate, but is very kindly standing in for Maria Caulfield, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Next is Johnny Denis from the Green Party. I should say that Nancy is representing the Conservatives this evening. Next to Johnny is Ollie Henman of the Lib Dems. Then Kate Chappell for Labour. And Paul Cragg is an independent. Just to say a little bit more, Nancy Dixon has very kindly stood in for Maria Caulfield. I think not very much noticed, and we're extremely grateful to you for doing so and for making time to come and join us here. You say you're a lawyer, but not, I think, an expert particularly in climate change. Is that right, or do you know something about it that you haven't revealed?
Well, I think I know something about it, but I can't say that I'm an expert.
Right. Well, that's a good start anyway. Thank you for coming. Why Maria Caulfield is not here, I can't say, except for when I'm just going to say that the organisers asked her why she couldn't be here, and she replied that she was busy. I think the net result appears to be that Maria has now, it appears that she has an extra day free to campaign, which the four candidates here with us do not have. You will form your own conclusions. Nancy, I'll come to you in just a moment, just to run through the other candidates who are here. Number 2 is who? Kate. Yes, Kate Chappell. Kate was born and grew up in Plumpton and now lives in Lewes with her family. She did a Master's in Sustainable Development at an environmental NGO called Forum for the Future, which you may have heard of. Then set up 3 recycling social enterprises, all of which are still operating. She then moved to Manchester, where she became a member of the City Council's executive for the environment. Her latest distinction is to have been arrested on Whitehall in October in the Extinction Rebellion activity going on there. Next to me is a man of relative mystery, because all my notes here about him is you're now retired from local business, a camping business, a locally run one, and you're standing as an independent. So perhaps you will tell us more about yourself as the evening wears on. Good, thank you very much. Then fourth is Johnny Denis for the Green Party. Johnny, as well as being a parish councillor, was re-elected to Lewes District Council in May. He joined the cabinet in July when the Cooperative Alliance finally took control of the council, and a Green motion to declare a climate emergency and to set a path for the council was passed. Welcome, Johnny. Thank you. And the fifth speaker is Ollie Henman of the Lib Dems, who lives in Lewes with his wife and 2 young children who attend a local primary school. He's a town councillor, was a member of the Save Lewes Schools campaign, and works with a number of local community groups. He's an environmental campaigner with 20 years of experience with international charities, including with partners across South America, Africa and Asia, and he's been active with the Lib Dems since the early 2000s. Right, that's your comment. Now, the question I'm going to ask each of you, in the same order, starting with you, Nancy, and working to you, Ollie, at the end, is this. And I'm going to ask you to be brief and focused with it. What will your party do about the climate and ecological emergency? 4 minutes each, please, no more. If you stray beyond 4 minutes, I shall ask you to stop talking. Thank you. Nancy.
Right, well thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for not pelting me with eggs. I have to just say that I did receive the questions that we're going to talk about later a couple of hours ago, and I'm not very comfortable to talk about them because I haven't had any time to review them, because I don't think it's fair, whether you like my party or not, it's not fair for me to make a botch of it. So with your kind permission, after this little segment, I will take my leave and let you all get on with that.
Why don't you go now?
Respect, please.
Well, I certainly
He doesn't want to answer the questions.
Would you mind letting Nancy say what she has to say and then making your points afterwards? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I don't know that, I think it's very sad that the notion of working together has come to this. That I've come here because I'm also a district councillor, because I live in the district, I live in Wivelsfield Green, I live on a farm next to methane producing animals, unfortunately. I care deeply about the environment. I care about each and every person that lives here. I care about each and every person that lives on this planet. I have a 1.5-year-old grandson that I want to see grow up, and I want to see him have a life, and I want to see the best life that we can possibly give him. I'm old enough that I remember back in the 60s and the 70s that we all worried about population growth, and we were all absolutely terrified about it, when we weren't worried about being killed by atomic bombs. And 40 years on, look at what's happened, and what have we each got to say for it? Those of us of a certain age, what have we done on a daily basis? I go to work every day. I don't work. We set up charities around the world. This is something that I care about. It's something that Maria has been involved in as well. You know, I'm here because I've watched her work as, whether you vote for her or not, I've watched her work as a member of parliament and worked her socks off to try to do the best for us. You may not think she's done a good job. That's fair. But I also can't say that in the years that I've been alive that I haven't prevented any of this. I do my bit every day. One of the last questions is what's the Christmas present that we're going to give that's going to deal with the thing. I've got bracelets, 4 oceans, 1 pound of rubbish is taken out of the ocean. That's what my kids and my nieces and nephews and stuff are getting for Christmas. That's a very small, very, very small thing. But that's what every single person sitting in this room and sitting on this planet needs to do. No matter how much money you have or money you don't have, it's all about us. And I can read you this stuff about what the party says, and you'll all go, you know, but it's all about us. There is no such thing as government. Government's just people. It's, excuse me. It's all about people, and that's what if each of us isn't doing our part. Someone said to me about what kind of car people drive. It's every single person's everything that they do every day that makes a difference. And I'm sorry that you feel so badly about me and this party, but I thank you for giving me a few minutes just to be here with you.
Nancy, I must ask you to stop there, but thank you very much for coming. Kate, please, 4 minutes.
The Labour Party has over 100 amazing policies that are really substantive, that address the ecological and climate emergency. But I'm not going to talk about those. I want to talk really briefly about the high-level approach we're taking, because that's what gets me most excited. So there are 4 things the Labour Party are doing in our approach to this issue. The first thing is we are acknowledging it. We are acknowledging the scale and the urgency. We are acknowledging the impacts that we are already seeing in this country and globally. And we are acknowledging the future impacts and who they're going to hurt the most. The second thing we're doing is showing leadership. We, human beings, created this problem. And over the last 50 years, we've really, really ramped it up. But the good thing about that is that we have agency, and we can now put our minds to it and do something about it. But governments willing to be involved in that process has been eroded over time until we're at the point we're at now, where government is just a bystander, wringing its hands as corporations hollow out our environment, our natural resources, and actually human beings in our society as well. So it is time for government to show leadership and to step back in. Enough of standing back. The Labour Party will be unequivocal in demanding the change that's needed. The third thing that we're going to do is invest. And you'll probably hear me say this word quite a lot tonight. It's one of our favourite words at the moment. The Labour Party is going to invest £250 billion in a green transformation fund. We're going to invest £1.5 billion that the Conservatives had set aside for road building into reducing our train fares and making them affordable. That one was announced today. We're going to invest £7.5 billion in our national park. This is just a quick rundown. There's loads and loads and loads more. And the fourth thing we're going to do is change the rules. I'm sure many of us here, as Nancy was saying, have done our bit. We've done a recycling right, we've got our keep cut, we've refilled our lentils, we've rode our bikes, we've done all that stuff. But that individual action has not been met by equivalent action from corporations in particular, and it is not enough for us to do it ourselves. One tiny, tiny example. WH Smith in town. You can't buy recycled printer paper in WH Smith, and you can't get a paper bag, virgin paper that you take away in a plastic carrier bag today in Lewes in WH Smith. It's ridiculous, it's not good enough, and the Labour Party will take on companies that don't do enough and don't do their fair share of work on climate change, and we will take on the polluters, we will fine them, we will delist them from the London Stock Exchange.
Thank you very much, Katie. The floor is yours.
Do you mind if I stand?
I do.
When you look at the environment, you have to look at 5 things. There is a space-time fabric of gravitational and quantum fields that we live in the galaxy. It takes 250 million years to go around the galaxy once, and we're in the 21st year. The first thing I would do would be to legislate to stop the pollution of the electromagnetic spectrum and stop 5G. I would work with Huawei, the largest infrastructure company on the planet, to work with University of Edinburgh to develop technologies that can give us the communications that we need, but out of the blue spectrum. Are you all familiar with the human chakra system, the energy system? 5G goes into the blue range, and it's a really stupid thing to do. That would be the first thing I'd do. Second, we're in a solar biosphere. Without the sun, there would be no life at all. Bacteria live in the vents of oxygen at the bottom of the sea, and everything that all the energy we get, ultimately comes from the sun. So under energy policy, we'll be looking at all of our CO2 emissions. But CO2 is only one part of the story. The gases that are going up there are containing hundreds of synthetics, and they're landing all over the planet. Then you've got the hydrosphere, the hydrobiosphere. The oceans are going dead. Plastic, they're probably going to die anyway. There's so much plastic in them now. What would I do for water? I'd ban putting chlorine into the water that we drink. We have a human biosystem that's called our second brain, and we're killing out our intelligence by doing it. And then you've got the terrestrial biosphere. We're polluting it with the built environment. And we're spreading our sewage sludge all over our agricultural land that contains all sorts of plastic pollutants, synthetics. I'd be putting them in a smaller area of land, keeping it off the agricultural land, and using bioremediation to treat the poisons in the sewage sludge that we have, rather than spreading it on the agricultural land. Ultimately, it's all a waste of time. We're not going to win this war, all the while the 193 economic entities of the United Nations continue on a policy of economic growth. It's completely stupid.
Thank you very much, Paul. Johnny.
Hi, I'm Johnny Denis, and it's Denis like the Blondie song, not like Denis. Let's be clear, this is an absolute emergency, and the response to it has to start now. We should have started 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but we are where we are. We have to start from today. We have to take it forward. And we can't just put it off until we get the right technology or imagined technology to capture carbon. We have to start right away. So whichever Greens are elected, we're standing at over 500 this time. Whichever Greens are elected to stand alongside Caroline Lucas in Parliament, they will be working like she does, like she has for the last 10 years, working hard for our environment. And she has already had the experience of introducing bills to Parliament, and she will, and they will, and we will continue to put forward bills. In the first 2 years of this Parliament, we will put forward 10 bills to Parliament. The first of which is the most important. It's the hinge on which everything else rests. It's the Green New Deal. It's a transformative bill that will change the shape of how we deal with everything else. And it's a 10-year plan that means that we're climate neutral in 10 years. Okay, so it's a 10-year plan. And it covers everything from our economy to transport, to energy, to building, to food and farming. It covers the whole gamut of those areas. But beyond that, we will introduce a People's Vote Bill, a reinstatement of the NHS Bill. We will fully fund further and higher education and have a bill for renters' rights. That we bill on a sustainable economy to make sure our economy functions within our ecological capacity. We can't just act like it doesn't exist. Setting targets on biodiversity and soil health, and we'll have a stronger eco-protection body. A future generation bill will make sure that the voices of future generations are heard at every point when we're making legislation. And because sustainable society is a just society, we will be introducing a universal basic income bill to replace our mean-minded, means-tested, punitive welfare arrangements. A new homes bill will include 100,000 new council homes of the highest sustainable construction methods so that they are cheap to run, as well as less impactful. And finally, we'll introduce a voting reform bill so that 16 and 17-year-olds will have the right to vote, and we can say goodbye to the first past the post system. Just imagine how much more we could do with 2 or 3 or 10 Carolines. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Ollie.
Thank you very much. So yes, I am the Lib Dem parliamentary candidate, but I'm also a fellow traveller with many of you as an environmental campaigner. I'd like to talk a little bit about that before I go on to the policies that we're proposing. I grew up partly in Brazil, in the Amazon, and as a child I saw firsthand what was happening in Brazil. I then went back a number of times myself and worked directly in the Amazon. I was there in Acre, which is the state right on the border between Brazil, Peru and Bolivia, which was the home state of Marina Silva, who became the environment minister under Lula. And I was there in Brazil when that government came in 2002 and saw some of the massive changes that they brought in Brazil and the way that they were able to guarantee the rights to the land of the Amazon at that time. And I think it's absolutely shocking to see what's happening now in Brazil with President Bolsonaro, a climate change denier, a fossil fuel fanatic, and an agribusiness bigot. And I think it's essential that we understand that this is a global phenomenon that we're facing. This is not by accident. The same people behind Bolsonaro are behind Brexit and behind Trump. We are facing a global... It's a global takeover by the right, the far right, and this is very, very different from anything we've seen before. And that's why for the Lib Dems, fighting Brexit is as important and goes hand in hand in fighting the climate emergency. The two are part of the same progressive internationalist agenda that we've been fighting for. And that's why I'm standing here. We need to fight together. We must stop this extreme agenda in its tracks. And I believe the UK can be a place that it's stopped in the same way that Trump must be impeached in the US. So that's why I'm here today. And in terms of what we're proposing as Lib Dems, we have a number of realistic and also ambitious targets to actually get us there step by step, because we do have 10 years. I agree, it's 10 years to change the world. And I believe that we have to start with very practical steps. Now, we have in the past invested in what was called the Green Investment Bank. The Tories have now sold that off to an Australian hedge fund. We want to reinvest in that Green Investment Bank, £10 billion from the public sector, which would unlock another £100 billion in terms of private capital into the renewable energy sector. We also want to see home insulation. I mean, we saw earlier on the slides, homes are a big part of where energy is being lost, and that would also make it easier, particularly for those on low incomes. We want to subsidise home insulation so they can also save on their bills. We also want to see a change in terms of our transport system. Electric buses, improve the railways, and bring in more cycle routes. We need to move away from cars. And I have to say I'm disappointed that Maria Caulfield isn't here tonight to tell us about her plans to build a motorway through the South Downs and to dual and double the A27. We have to fight against that. We have to stop that. And now is our chance to do that. So I would urge you to think seriously. This is our chance, and I stand here to represent you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Thank all of you, all five of you, for your contribution so far. Nancy, I think you suggested you wanted to withdraw at some point. If you want to slip out now, because we're moving on to another phase. If so, I would say thank you for coming and for what we've done.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. We're now moving on to a session where we will hear some of the questions which have been submitted in advance. There were a lot of questions, and sorting them out and trying to get them into a form where we could deal with them precisely, concisely, and quickly and fairly took a lot of doing by the organisers. However, they have done their best, and they hope that you will be happy. I'm not going to read them out. You deserve a change of voice, heaven knows. They're going to be read for us by two younger residents of Lewes, quite a lot younger in this case, Katie and Tanu. They're speaking, if I can coin a phrase, they're speaking for the voters of tomorrow, because what tonight's about, largely, is trying to be different, stressing that what we're here for is to work out what action is planned for the future of the younger generations. So we hope that he will do that. They're going to take it in turn to read the questions. A word to the panellists. Please don't feel that you have to answer or comment on every question that's asked. If you want to, we'll try and fit you in. If you don't want to, then let's save the time and go on somewhere else. However, if you are singled out, we hope you will answer whoever's asking you the question. To the members of the audience, if you're asking a question, or if one of your questions is being read out, it would help if you can identify, if it's not already clear, which member of the panel you would like to answer it. If you're happy for anyone to answer it, that's fine, then it's going to be all for one and one for all. But please, if you want a specific answer, let them know. Okay, now we've got nearly an hour for this, we're losing a bit of time, but off we go. Are you both ready with your questions? And thank you very much. I'll be quiet until your turn.
This is a question about local transport from Paula Cohen. Transport is responsible for nearly 30% of the EU's total carbon emissions, of which 72% comes from road transportation, according to the EU Parliament's website. What do the candidates propose to do about changing the priority given to cars in favour of pedestrians and cyclists in towns like Lewes, Polegate, Seaford and Newhaven?
Anyone in particular who wants to? You're volunteering.
Well, I'm happy to go, as I have the mic, I'll pass it on. I mean, I absolutely agree that we need to look at how the focus in transport is shifted away from the car. As I mentioned before, I mean, I think the real risk at the moment with what the Conservatives are proposing is just to invest more and more in roads and more in cars. We want to see much more accessibility in our towns in terms of pedestrian-friendly use of the space, traffic calming, drop curbs, improved crossings, reducing HGVs on our roads. We're also looking much more at cycling, and I believe we work closely with other parties on that, particularly when you look at the Egrets Way connecting Lewes and Newhaven and other cycle routes that we can develop across the area. We also need to be bold. I mean, road building is a thing of the past. We need to shift the subsidies. We were hearing earlier about the amount of subsidy that goes into fossil fuels. If we shifted the amount of money that's being pumped into roads towards improving our rail, to electrify our rail, it would have a massive impact. So I think we really need to take bold steps now.
Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Ollie said. I think the one other aspect that he hasn't covered that I'm really in favour of and excited about is measures around schools in particular. So, for example, closing the roads around schools during drop-off time and pick-up time to encourage parents to do those drop-offs on foot or cycling. I think that's a really important way of getting people out of their cars on a daily basis. Also, it's much safer for children, obviously.
Paul?
Unless we stop the global game of economic growth, where 193 sovereign nations at the United Nations are in a race with each other for economic power, domination, so they can buy more guns, try to stop the Americans, which are making war all over the world, we stand no hope of reducing our emissions. I do know that for every 1% of economic growth that we get, we require a third of a human resources. A human resource. You don't get economic growth without people. You don't get economic growth without fossil fuels. This idea of continuous economic growth is ridiculous. It's a complete madness. What, until we tarmacked over the whole planet? That's what we have to understand. I know you all want more money in your pockets. But sooner or later, we're going to have to understand that we've got to stop the economic growth race. Who remembers Adrienne Campbell? Yeah? So she taught me, she was a great inspiration. And she taught me many things. But she taught me how to measure. And the day that she published her CO2 emissions when she took a flight somewhere was the day I stopped flying. And it's the reason that I know that I've emitted 1,334 grams of carbon getting here tonight. And I'm going to emit the same going home tonight.
Well, can I just see if Johnny wants to come in, and then we'll have to draw this one to a close.
Thanks for the question. I'll sit down if you don't mind. Two major directions here. So first of all, we have to make active travel. That's walking, cycling, living streets approach. Absolutely an easy choice. So really, so you do redesign towns so that actually safe, comfortable and comforting to live and work and walk around a town that's safe. Okay, but secondly, you have to have absolutely efficient, regular, reliable and affordable public transport. And if you haven't got the second one, then you are going to be screwed on the first one, because people in the town have one set of a vision about how the town should be, whether it's clean air, whether it's manageable to live in. But a lot of people see this as their local town if they don't live in the town. And many of us live outside the town. Obviously, this is just a town of 15,000, 16,000 people in a district of 100. It's a major centre for people. They've got to be able to get here if you want them to be able to use the resources and the services and the goods and the shops and everything else that's available in the town. So there's two ways of doing that. So you have to make sure it's accessible to people through affordable public transport, and you've got to make sure that people have less need to travel because they've got goods and services and jobs near where they are. And right now that isn't the case, so you have to address them hand in hand. Affordable public transport, safe places to be, but also regenerating our villages, our communities, so that there's less need to travel in the first place.
Thank you, Johnny. I should have said earlier that if anyone who's standing would like to sit down, there are a couple of spare seats at the front, and some a little bit further back, and some right at the back. So do make yourselves more comfortable if you can. Right. Tell me, you got the next question, please? Or is it? Sorry, I'm losing track.
This question is about local planning from Natasha Padbury of Lewes.
Could you speak louder, please?
Okay, sorry. This question is about local planning from Natasha Padbury of Lewes. With global emissions still steadily rising and flood forecasts predicting unprecedented devastation across the Sussex coast and rivers by 2050, what emergency planning will you be investing in?
Did all the panel hear what the question was?
The question is?
Could you ask the question again, please?
With global emissions still steadily rising and the flood forecast predicting unpredicted devastation across the Sussex coast and rivers by 2050, what emergency planning will you be investing in?
What emergency planning will each of you be investing in to guard against the risk of flooding? That's basically it, I think. Yes? Okay. Johnny,
would you like to start since I've got the microphone? Let's try to do that. I've got a couple of notes here actually. Let's start with what we do differently, and what we really need to do is to build into our planning system. We need to be more restrictive about what we do in floodplains. That's a fairly basic starting point, and we still seem to be ignoring that despite all the best advice. And that means creating either innovative, permeable developments like Lewes Community Land Trust first proposed for what's now called the North Street Quarter quite a while back, and obviously that didn't get any traction at the time. Or you don't build them at all. It's fairly clear you've got to do one or the other of those. And we also need to look at things like natural water management and retention systems in place in the Upper Ouse, if we're particularly concerned about Lewes. When you've all probably heard about the reintroduction of beavers recently, that is part of that whole cascade of land management and water management in the catchment of the Upper Ouse. We've probably all seen, how vulnerable the Cuckmere Valley has been lately. And that means that we do have to start really planning for how do we look after our communities and know that we won't be able to defend every community in the constituency in the country forever. As waters rise, we will have to think again. So how long can we look after our low-lying communities? Otherwise, every single time where we build another defence, we're just waiting for the next time that one in 50 years, one in 100 years, chance of a flood overcoming that particular barrier. So we really need to be prepared for serious mitigation and serious planning ahead. And I'm not looking forward to that, and I'm sure nobody else is here too, but we must plan for the worst.
I remember a few years ago, somebody came up with a good plan, as they thought, for protecting Lewes against floods, and passed it by an expert who said, well, yes, it's a very good plan, but of course you do realise if you implement it, it will just have the effect of washing New Haven out to sea. So it's something to regard in a wider context than just primarily Lewes itself, I think. Another speaker from
Well, I was going through my list and I had quite similar points to Johnny, and I think it's absolutely right, as you say, that we need to get the balance right between the prevention and mitigation and adaptation. And I think we are in that phase, as we know that sea levels are changing. It is already happening, and so we do need to think creatively about how we use our space. But what I would say in practical terms, which I think hasn't been mentioned yet, is the role of the Environment Agency. And we've seen, again, huge reductions in budgets for the Environment Agency, the lack of ability to really see through those plans. So there are people who can help us and who have the modelling and who have the systems in place, but they're being held back because they themselves don't have the resources to do that role. So I think we need to reinvest in that and make sure that they can help us to plan ahead together across the whole area.
Anyone else from the panel? Kate.
A quick comment. I sat on the Regional Coastal Committee and Flooding Committee for the North West for a few years, and the evidence after all of the... So I attended some of the emergency planning meetings with all of the emergency services, all of the councils, and lots of the meteorologists, and the infrastructure providers. And it was really interesting to see the level of detail that they planned for which roads were going to be flooded, which key infrastructure, which power plants, substations were at risk. So it's that level of planning, emergency planning, that will be going on in this region as well. But actually, when after there was massive flooding, they did a huge debrief and looked at what the most effective measures were, and many of them came down to community actions, particularly around community resilience and early warning systems that communities could organise themselves. Really, really simple things like foam trees. And in one community, is that the microphone?
Was it something I said?
It's a drum roll. In one community, the solution was for someone to go out and start ringing a bell when the floodwaters were beginning to rise, to advise all of their neighbours. And the focus was very much on flooding resilience. So how quickly can people, can communities and shops get back on their feet after a flooding event? And yeah, so those are the major lessons that we took from there. The community resilience, flooding resilience, getting back on your feet, and the community action around it is absolutely key.
Thank you very much, Kate.
I know why the Lewes landed up on water in 2000. I live in the floodplain about half an hour north of here, right on the Lewes. And they took out the Victorian bridge, the old brick bridge, and it used to have just a small hole for the ooze to go, and the highways took out the bridge and put a clear span. We used to be flooded for 3 or 4 days when it rained hard. Guess what? It all lands up with you guys in Lewes now. Exactly what I would do in emergency planning, I haven't got a clue.
Thank you very much. This seems the right moment to say that the loudspeakers here, the sound system seems sensitive and delicate. And if you cannot hear, either on the platform or in the hall, please make that clear. Because if you're not hearing, then you're wasting your time, and it's going to be a silly way to use the evening. Please wave a hand or something if you want the sound adjusted. Right, next question, please.
This question is from Emma Roberts and Jem Fryer. What are your plans for supporting biodiversity, rewilding and natural carbon sequestration in the local area?
Anyone in particular? Is this aimed at anyone? Or all comers?
Shall I just
Right, we didn't get much last time.
One thing we've got to get our head around is banning synthetic chemicals on a global basis, whether it's in the built environment or whether it's in agricultural chemicals. We've just got to get rid of them completely. There's no such thing as a synthetic chemical that has no natural biological pathway through the human system. They're poisons. Until we stop making them, until we stop spraying them on our agricultural crops, we're going to be reducing our biodiversity. They are poisons.
Thank you. Kate, you wanted to say something like
The Labour Party has published a fantastic document called A Plan for Nature, and it's precisely about how we do these things nationally, and it involves an investment of £1.2 billion to restore natural habitats, and that's, you know, these are the things that actually, these are the reasons. I mean, we care about the impacts of climate change because of the flooding we've just talked about, and the terrible storms, and, you know, all of those terrifying impacts. But the positive side of the equation is the beautiful nature we see around us, especially from Lewes, where we are here today, but across the constituency. It's such a wonderful landscape, and we are so lucky here with the landscape and the biodiversity. You know, the grazing sheep is a great way of sequestering carbon, and that's the way this landscape has been for so many years. We're extremely lucky to have it, and yeah, there's lots and lots of great. I'm losing my train of thought, so I'm going to pass on, and then maybe it'll come back to me. I'll come back with a vengeance.
Well, I would just bring it briefly to the local level. I agree that we are in such an incredible area with the South Downs, an area of very high biodiversity, and I know that there are a number of projects already underway looking at the rewilding question, both in East and West Sussex. And I think I was just talking to Glyndebourne the other day, and they're considering within their own land management to look at how they can encourage more trees and enable the natural biodiversity to increase through allowing that rewilding process. And I think we have a real opportunity here, and as we know, trees are one of the best ways to capture carbon, and different ways of allowing regeneration to come through will also help us to bring down our carbon emissions.
Thank you. Did you all hear everything you wanted to hear in that last moment? Good. Fine. Sing out if you vote.
Would it be right if I spoke on it too?
Sorry, John. You're too far away.
You can't see me. I'll stand up. The Green Party and the Green Party Manifesto, which is called If Not Now, When, it includes obviously serious elements about environmental management and a whole host of policies related to that, but one of which is introducing a crime of ecocide to make sure that it's actually not because we're talking specifically locally, we were asked about, and that I'm lucky enough to be a cabinet member on the Cooperative Alliance, which runs Lewes District Council, and I'm pleased to say that Cooperative Alliance of three parties and the independents has come up with some great things, and one part of that is actually having a pollinator strategy, so that actually we plan for our pollinators, so that we actually look at how do we improve the possibility that we can regenerate and we can have rich and diverse ecology because of pollinators alongside a pesticide strategy. which means that we actually reduce absolutely to the very bare bones of minimum that we can at the moment, and trying to take that to zero. And it's by doing those sort of actions that can be replicated nationally. Obviously they can be done. If we can do it locally, then of course they can be done at a much bigger scale and done better. And part of, yet another thing is that we're losing a lot of ash trees. So a lot of them are going to be coming down in the constituency over the next year or two. In the new year there's going to be lots lost in Lewes on the Open Road. And part of and that's going to be tragic, because it's going to be a change in the landscape. Although photos of 80 years ago, there are no trees there. So it's interesting how things change and regenerate. But natural regeneration of land seems to be a much better for ecological richness. So if it's with a bit of management rather than a massive replant. We do, however, also need to do major replanting and lots of new trees. Okay, like millions. We're talking millions and millions of new trees.
Okay, Johnny, thank you very much.
I did, yeah.
You did. All right, stick it in the next one.
Yep.
This question on climate justice was sent in anonymously. We have two crises facing us: growing inequality and poverty, nationally and globally, and the climate emergency. Mainstream political thinking summarizes that the solution to one compromise the other. For instance, the belief that economic development to improve inequality means using more fossil fuels, and using personal taxes to change behaviour to tackle the climate emergency damage the poorest. What are your ideas to solve this paradox?
Johnny, as I squeezed you out last time, why don't you go first this time?
No, I didn't. It's all right. You've still. But I'm happy to start if you want, wherever. Or Ronnie can go. It's not my
No, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just check my notes. Right. So the Green New Deal is actually it's actually transformational about how we address the climate emergency, but it's got to be just and fair. And underpinning that is our policy of having a universal basic income, which means an end to all that mean-minded, horrible stuff about means-tested benefits. It means everybody has a right. It's a bit like child benefit, if anybody remembers that. So it's a universal basic income that liberates the poorest people, and liberates those people who are otherwise carers, all sorts of in other positions. It takes away the precariousness of existence for so many people, because it's right there at the start. Instead of having a safety net that's so chock full of holes and sharp pointy things underneath it that you fall through, it's actually a platform that everybody has a basic security, and that's what is underpinning the whole of the Green New Deal. So thank you.
So I think one of the key points that you mentioned in the question there is to challenge the principle of growth, unchecked economic growth. We have to look at our economy in a different way, and I think it's unrealistic to say that the world is just going to continue growing and growing at the scale that we've seen in the past. I mean, that just doesn't allow for sustainability. If we're talking about real sustainability, we need to look at how we live within our means, within planetary boundaries, as the UN likes to term it. So this is a moment where we need to rethink the whole model, and I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think we need to balance out economic, social and environmental needs. We need to look at a just transition, so we propose a just transition commission that would look at all elements of this. We also want to look at a well-being budget, so it's not just based on economic growth, but actually what are the other measures, what are the other indicators that we can use to actually look at the health and the livelihood of people in the country. Finally, we want to make sure that as part of that just transition, that we support those on low incomes to be part of and benefit from the new technologies and the new opportunities that will come with the green industrial revolution. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's a bit confusing to be on the podium, because actually we've all got very similar policies on this, so it's difficult to distinguish ourselves, because, I mean, the Labour Party has a policy called the Green Industrial Revolution, which is the same as the Green New Deal, picks up many of the elements that Johnny has been talking about. I think the key thing that I would probably distinguish about the Labour's Green New Deal, Green Industrial Revolution, is the extent to which we are proposing over a period of 10, 11 years to refocus jobs in the economy. So the Labour Party's proposal is to create 1 million new, well-paid, unionised, secure, green jobs. So it's really about retraining people out of current dirty and polluting industries, giving them opportunities to retrain and join the green industries of the future, and offering climate apprenticeships to people as they leave school to really skill up. And that is our way of taking both the social justice problem and the climate justice problem, two sides of the same coin, but actually completely inverting it as a problem, creating a massive opportunity, and setting us on a path to achieving net zero carbon by 2030.
I'm a bit deaf and I didn't hear the question exactly, and I haven't exactly worked out what the question is after my colleagues have answered it. Well, I think the question was about inequality and global poverty. Was it?
No.
Was it global poverty and inequality? Wasn't that?
And sustainability.
How you tackle climate and how you tackle poverty, and I think, is that more like it? Yes. How you tackle both of those together.
I'm not going to try to tackle them both together. I'm just going to make the point. I'm not going to try to put them together. I'm just going to make the point that the inequality between the rich and the poor is a spiritual problem.
What?
It's a spiritual problem. You can't see it. You can't touch it. 3 parts of who I am are invisible. My spiritual nature, my emotional nature, and my thinking nature. You can't see. But if you can manage the inside like we can with the technologies of consciousness that the world, the global country of world peace, which we've been building for many, many years, it'll sort out those problems at a global basis.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
I think if it's a spiritual matter, it reminds me of that thing that one of the characters in that wonderful sitcom Father Ted used to say. That would be an ecumenical matter, wouldn't it? Apologies to Father Jack. I guess most of you will never speak to me again, but I think we're reaching a point where we have to introduce a limit to the number of questions we can still take from my 2 questions. I think we can, if we're lucky, get in 3 more at the most. Otherwise, we're not going to have any time for the questions from the floor, which is an important part of this evening. So, can I ask for the next question? Probably 3 is what we're going to manage. Okay? Who's next?
This is a question on trade from Stephen Watson. Given the significant contribution that shipping and air freight makes to global emissions of CO2 and other pollutants, do you agree that the UK should concentrate on trading links with our geographical near neighbours, such as Europe, rather than geographically distant ones, such as America and China?
Who's going to take the easy one?
I'm going to answer very briefly and at face value, and then let others expound. But my answer is simply no. I don't agree with that. It's not not a discussion about Brexit. But I think there's no point buying.
It's all about Brexit.
I know. But I'm going to let the others. But
I see you're ducking on the fence again.
I know. I mean, I can give you. If someone asks me about Brexit, I'll
no, we're not talking about Brexit right now.
You're not asking.
It's not specific.
At face value, answer the question. No, I don't think we should. I don't think it makes any difference. I don't think we should be buying a tat from France. I think we should be really careful, seriously, about what it is that we go out and buy every single day in our lives, when we do our supermarket shop or wherever we get whatever comes into our house and our lives. We need to be really, really careful about what that is. And it's not important so much where it comes from. I mean, obviously, it is important what it's made from and how it has travelled, but whether it's fit for purpose, how long it lasts for, are much more important questions than whether it comes from France or further away. Sustainable consumption is a much, much bigger question than just the transport impacts that it has.
Thank you, Kate.
Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, I do think it is about Brexit. And I think it comes back to the point about transport and how we have a role in the world. I mean, so in practical terms, I think moving goods from just across the channel by ship is much, much more sustainable than flying things over from other parts of the world. And I think it's really essential that we do continue to have that very close relationship with our closest neighbours and allies. And we also have to remember that by being part of the EU, we are also part of the most ambitious environmental and sustainable targets around the world. The EU sets standards. The other part of this question mentions the USA and China. So if we were to say we walk away from European standards and instead we start trading with the US, we would have to adopt much, much lower standards. As we know, we'd have to accept the kinds of products that are produced with massive amounts of pesticides, with hormones, with other kinds of very nasty products that would undermine our own production, our own agricultural production. And I think we have to bear that in mind, that this is a major choice for the future, whether or not our own agriculture survives if we were to make that kind of deal. So I think it really is an existential moment for us. Thank you.
Outside of the... Sorry, I was going to say outside the European Union, I didn't mean that. Let's put Europe aside as a European Union aside for a moment and discussions about leaving it. But for the last decades, when I was a kid, we used to import crap from Hong Kong. I think before that was Japan, then it was Hong Kong, and it's been Taiwan, and it's been all sorts of range of other places from all over the world, regardless of whether we've been part of the EC or Europe. So we're quite capable of, consuming rubbish, no matter which union we're part of. And I just, let's be clear on that bit, first of all. And we do need to address consumption habits and patterns and all sorts of things. And we probably need to look, we certainly need to look about how we determine what is good trade in the first place, and how we do trade well, that is also as sustainable and just for the people that are producers, as we can make it. So wherever in the world that is, it should be it should be done equitably and fairly, and to high standards that doesn't degrade the country and degrade the people and degrade the soil, and ruin our climate. And all of those things need to be addressed. And I quite like being part member of the European Union. Thank you.
Can I say what I want in 1 minute? The first thing I'm going to say is certainly not escape the Brexit question. From an economic point of view, it is a really, really stupid idea. My trade policy is the same as my procurement policy. You should feed yourself, clothe yourself, house yourself from resources available in your immediate environment. And that should be our national trade policy as well as your personal policy. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The penultimate question, I think it's going to be.
This is a question on the voting process in Lewes constituency in light of the climate emergency taken from a number of questions sent in by local people. In this election, climate considerations alone suggest that we need to prevent another 5 years of Conservative rule. And in Lewes, we are better placed than most to unseat the Conservative MP. Would a tactical vote in this constituency be the best way of preventing the worst electoral outcome for the environment?
Something to say about that?
I happen to be holding the microphone.
Shall I answer? I mean, it is so difficult because when you cast a vote, you are doing two things. You are part of the tally to elect, to decide who gets the most votes and who's going to be MP for the constituency, obviously. But your vote does something else as well. It is an expression of your view, and I think that is a really important part of voting. Now, you know, and I think it's just worth not like keeping hold of that too. Obviously, you know, it's up to every voter on how they vote. My job as the Labour Party candidate for this constituency is to lay out our manifesto, to be about some of our policies, you know, and with the official opposition, it's really important that I'm here doing that, and you will make your mind up. But yeah, don't forget that it's an expression of what you believe, as well as you know, a calculation of who you want to win in a particular constituency.
Thank you very much.
Well, tactical voting, you can always vote for me. I think.
That was nice and clear.
I think if you're not going to vote for me, I would like to see the other candidates that are not Ollie step down, not to step down. I would like to see that. I'd like to see Ollie come forward and win the seat and stop Brexit.
How do you follow that kind of thing?
Agree?
I'm trying to. So I thought you didn't really stand out. No. So the amount of times that over the years I've been asked to stand down is really quite numerous, and this time the pressure's really been on. But if I'd stood down in 1983, I think was the first time I stood, and every time I've stood since then in every election at every level that I've stood in. This is the first time I've stood in a general election. I've stood in every other level, including European. And if I'd stood down, we wouldn't have a cooperative alliance run district council. We wouldn't have my ward being represented by 3 Green councillors. We wouldn't have every other ward in Lewes town being represented by Green councillors and a single independent. That's it's the only political party is represented in Lewes town or Lewes district. From the town on Lewes district are Greens. But if none of them would exist, if none of us had stood, because what happened when the Labour Party first existed? Were the Liberals or the Radicals suggested, don't stand, you'll split the Liberal vote? And the Labour Party is now quite a reasonably sized party. And you know, parties don't get bigger if they stand down. They don't represent people's views effectively if they keep standing down. Right. So if you roll over and stand down at every possible opportunity, well, what would be the point of the existence of a political party? And if we had stood down all those years ago, would we be discussing the climate emergency on this stage right now? So I just want to bear that
Thank you, Johnny. And I think it's quite significant to note again that the Conservative candidate is not even here, and she has not engaged with any of you. She clearly doesn't care about this particular issue, and I think it is important to note that we, the 3 main parties that you see here, are actually in agreement with most of what we've discussed tonight. However, I would say that in this particular election, as various people have said, we are facing, and I've said it myself, we are facing an existential threat to this country. And I do think that the most overriding issue has to be to stop a Conservative majority. And I have to say that the Liberal Democrats are the most well-placed to do that in this particular constituency. Now, what I would commit to all of those who may consider that tactical choice, and I know it's a difficult choice for many people, what I would commit to, and as I said at the last hustings, is that I will be responsive and I will look to convene meetings of this nature on a very regular basis in a very different way from the current Conservative MP. I would be accountable and I would take on the challenge of the climate emergency as your representative if elected. So I really hope you can bear that in mind, and thank you for considering.
Thank you. At the risk of offending almost all of you here, I'm going to say that's almost the last question. We have time for one more from our two question readers before we have to move on to the questions from the floor. So, I don't know whether you've got it, but it's all yours now.
Finally, on a more festive note, what is one thing you will personally be doing to address the climate emergency for this Christmas?
What will you be doing to address the climate emergency over Christmas? Is that for this Christmas? What are you going to do? Are you going to be Father Jack again?
I'm going to stay at home with friends, cook organic food. I'm not going to drive, I'm not going to fly anywhere, and my environmental impact will be the minimum it possibly could.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to tell us how they're going to spend Christmas or not? You suddenly seem to be smitten by silence.
I think I'm going to be really mean and ask my family not to give my little girls any presents. It's all just one, so that it's just obscene the amount of presents that children get and the amount of plastic crap that fills up your house, and it's just not necessary. And actually, there are so many other ways that my family can show, celebrate with my children and show them love without giving them plastic crap. And they can just unwrap an empty box, maybe just as happy actually.
This is an evening about the younger generation and what they can expect. I hope your children haven't come with you.
I'm also a dad, and I very much agree with what you've just said, Kate. And I think it's important for younger generation to think about different ways of celebrating together and focusing more on craft and producing things together in a collaborative way. And I think that's really the heart of what Christmas should be about, and spending time together as a family. I mean, I've been a little bit busy recently, so I'm looking forward to a few quieter days and actually just having that collaborative time together.
Thank you. Sorry?
So to say a bit more about what some people have just said, I think the idea of bringing people together. Last night, it wasn't last night, it was just mid-afternoon. I was thinking last night, but it was so dark, and of course it needs to be dark, because I'm talking about the lighting up, the official lighting up of Blind Christmas Tree, which is actually such a convivial community event that it actually brought people together, and it was the official mark of Christmas. And actually that sort of experience of just being together with friends and just chatting and passing time of day and cheering on the children doing amazing things is just brilliant. And that's the only thing that's really exciting. Apart from that, I'll be really mean and not send any cards, so consider that yourselves all have had one. Pretend just, would be grateful, please. I think nobody's getting any cards. I'm not getting any presents, I hope. And that's it. Try to do it lightly, really. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's one for you. Christmas is the winter solstice, when you have the lowest, most amount of dark and the least amount of light. As we go around the galaxy, there is something called the Great Year. It's 26,000 years long. We're just as, at the moment, leaving the age of Aquarius, leaving the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. On the vote, on the 12th of December, is 12, 12, 12. Add up 19 and you get 12. 12. Anybody remember the 12, 12, 12 before? You know, did anybody? No? Yes? We got the date wrong. It's on the full moon vote, 12/12/12, that comes up in a couple of weeks' time.
That's good for a pub quiz, isn't it? We are now going to stop here. Prepare questions. Tom and Katie very much. Reading the questions and getting the better of the sound system. And thank you to the panel for your important and helpful answers. I will leave it like that, I think. We now go on to questions from the floor. There is a roving mic. Please wait for it to reach you, or it may be even harder to hear than it would be otherwise, perhaps. Again, people on the floor in the body of the hall, please direct your question at a particular individual if it's meant for one of the four panelists. If it's not, then let it go. Panelists, please do not feel obliged to answer any question that you don't want to, because we must end this session by 9:30 so that we can be out of here by 10:15. I hope that all makes sense. Is the roving mic roving?
It's roving. I'm waiting for direction.
Well, that is
getting.
Can we have a question from the front row, please?
The Labour Party have promised to reduce rail fares. Other parties have promised to do things like increasing the number of teachers and nurses. There is the question with the railways of the capacity of the track and rolling stock and signalling. How is that going to be addressed? With nursing, similar. With teaching, similar questions of the basic infrastructure.
Thank you, Roger. Any railway person want to talk? Johnny.
You can go first. You want to back to speak?
Yeah. The Labour Party proposal is to take the, to not refranchise the railways and to take the railways into national ownership. And we feel that's the right thing to do because we feel like privatisation and franchising has really failed, particularly in the railways. I mean, in many of the natural monopolies, but very particularly in the railways. And I think, I was told the other day that apparently if your train is late and if you put in a claim to delay repay, it's not the train operator who reimburses you, it's the government who reimburses you. And this is the problem with all of our natural monopolies, rail, mail, energy and water. It's not the private companies who are operating these who pick up the tab for failure. They are always underwritten by government because these services are so completely critical to our everyday lives. So when we're in a situation where we're underwriting those services anyway, we're paying through the nose as a public for services that are simply mismanaged, with dividends extracted from them. The top cats paid absolutely massive salaries for not even delivering satisfactory services. What is the point of keeping it in private ownership? It makes no sense at all. Labour Party policy is to renationalise all of those industries I just mentioned, for slightly different reasons on all of them, but that's the big picture on all of those.
The Green Party is absolutely in favour of bringing the railways back into public control, and of course it makes sense. It's a natural monopoly and clearly should be managed in the interest of people, and people should be involved in that management. So as stakeholders, and they should be part of the means of control of it. But beyond that, actually, local infrastructure is inadequate, and we need to reopen the upfield link. Because that's, without that, it's kind of it is the missing link, and it needs to be there. And that way, that we can actually, we can create far more, there's going to be far more journeys available by train, which aren't currently available. So beyond that, we need to look at what other developments are there in the rail network. There is now, I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but you've heard of Transport for London, but there's now going to be something called Transport for the South East, which is a new sort of sub-regional body which will look at being an integrated transport provider for the South East. And it's talking about, it's even talking about decarbonisation, which is great news. Obviously, it's got targets in the wrong decade, by 2 decades, but it's looking in a joined up way around how to affect infrastructure changes in all of our transport network. And that's progress. It's not far enough, but it's progress because it's no longer up to a local authority just to build roads because it fancies it, or Highways England just to build roads because it fancies it, but because it's part of a strategic plan. That has to be, and that has to look at multimodal. Anybody familiar with that word? Where you look at all the modes of travel, whether it be, public transport, private transport, walking, cycling, or whatever. So we need to look much more strategically, and we need to look at the whole infrastructure, not just for one particular bit.
Okay, Johnny, thank you. Is this a supplementary question to the one that's just been asked?
No, next question.
Oh, well, that's good.
I'm just getting in
know what the next question is, I don't. Anyone else? Ollie?
Just a short additional point. I think I very much agree with what's been said, and I think it's clear that for us, where a particular franchise is failing, as we've seen with Southern Rail, then that should be taken back into public ownership. And I absolutely agree that there needs to be a much more integrated approach that connects with buses, cycle routes, and so on. The other thing I think that hasn't quite been mentioned is electrification of our rail network. So we need to shift out of diesel, we need to have proper electrification along all the main routes, and that would make a huge difference in terms of our carbon emission targets.
If this is a question about the rights or wrongs of privatisation or nationalisation, I've got a story to tell you. About 3 years ago, I went stark staring raving bonkers after a little misunderstanding with my wife, called the police and got arrested, sanctioned at Eastbourne Psychiatric Hospital. Cut a long story short, I got a bit pissed off with them and I landed up being arrested 4 times over the course of 4 years. But I certainly got a huge amount of experience with the police and the mental health services. Can I tell you, out of the 4 places that I got locked up in, can I tell you the one which was absolutely the worst of the lot? It was owned by private equity, the smartest money on the planet. They own 47,000 beds worldwide. And when I asked for Wi-Fi, I was told to. And I spent £100 on data from O2 with my phone stuck up in the window. This was the place that Eric Clapton went to dry out on cocaine, called the Priory.
A bit more detail.
Privatisation is just a way for smart money to make money out of government. It's not
I'm not meant to be doing this, I know, but there is one question and I've seen there, and there's another one there, and there's more than I can count up.
Can we have a question from the gentleman in the grey jumper? Thank you.
In 2015, I voted Green. I thought after a dozen years it was time I kind of voted more closer to what I wanted. And everybody knows what happened. I thought Norman Baker would have enough votes just to get through, and he didn't. And I've had 5 years of Maria Caulfield, and it's horrible. I really feel it in my heart when I see what she talks about and bringing the community together, and she does the opposite. So, I'm sorry, Johnny, and I'm a member, maybe for not much longer, I don't know. I need to ask you, what do you think you're doing standing here? Because if you don't think you can win, do we want another 5 years?
It doesn't work like that.
Yes, it does. Once past the post, it's brutal, and that's how it works. And we are in the middle of the worst possible election I've ever been present with.
And so it's up to the voters how to vote. I'm not going to make anybody vote in a particular way. People will vote for me if they want to vote for me, and they won't vote for me. So what you need to perhaps think of is how to be convincing in your arguments to those people you want to persuade to vote your way. That's the only thing that matters. So if you believe that, and you know, clearly you're really passionate about it, then it's up to you to persuade people to vote like you. And that nobody wins an election unless you get enough people who vote like you to get the result that you're looking for. It's about persuasion. And it certainly is about, you know, chastising and having a go at and stabbing at, and that's not going to do it. And so I just really want to leave it, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can we have a question from the woman on that side, please?
This one?
The one in green.
One in green.
The one in the green jumper.
I wanted to know, mainly from Johnny, what your plans are, or how can you deal with solar panels after they have been damaged or once they've just finished their active life? Because it seems to me if we all have solar panels, there'll just be more pollution. Because we can't really do anything with them after they've been damaged, can we?
That sounds like a technical question that I need to have some technical advice from. Anybody know the answer of how you recycle solar panels? I'm sure you can do it, and I don't know how it's done because it's not my business, but I'm sure there are people that will be able to advise you on that. I'm sorry I can't help.
Let's try and find someone who can answer it technically and get an answer for you later, because I don't think we're going to come up with one now, unfortunately, unless... Is there anyone who does know the answer?
I don't know the answer. Oh, does someone know?
No.
Unless you know the answer
Stick them on
to how you
anyway.
get rid of solar panels, I don't think we can use it at the moment. We need to move on.
Yes, we have a question from a gentleman in the blue t-shirt.
Yeah, my question's to anyone who's interested. I've just spent the last 7 months driving around the UK with my family, stopping in many communities. And I've really noticed the social divide in our country. And for me, most people are just trying to put bread on the table. And unless we address the social boundaries in our society and the social issues, you know, this is never going to change. You know, I imagine even the guy cutting the trees down in the Amazon's just trying to put bread on the table. So until we actually try and address the social issues and the divides in our society, which, you know, I'm astounded. I live in the city, but I'm astounded by the divides in our society. Yeah.
Have you got a specific question for one of the panel?
No, it's to anyone.
I think it's helpful if we can have actual questions rather than statements, although what you said is very interesting and valuable, but it does help the panellists if there are questions for them to answer. Ollie, you wanted to say?
I might have a
Can I say
reply.
Okay.
I completely agree with you. I think it is, along with the climate emergency, the most pressing issue. I think the really exciting thing is about trying to tackle those two things together. I think that is possible. And that's what the Green New Deal, the Green Industrial Revolution is all about.
And I wanted to answer because you mentioned the guy cutting the trees down in the Amazon, and it's true. I mean, I've spoken to some of those people, and you're right. Often they will say to me, well, it's all right for Europeans to talk about keeping the rainforest when they can't actually feed their own families, as you say. And I think this is unfortunately a symptom of the way that our economy has been geared, is that it pits us against each other, people against people, and the ones who are benefiting are the big corporations who are extracting all of the profits. And I think it is absolutely shocking. And I have to say I agree with the proposals that I've heard from Kate in terms of actually having proper regulation. And I think we do need to go back to looking at regulation and looking at proper tax reform. And that's why actually the Lib Dems have put forward some quite radical ideas on tax reform to actually look at it in a different way so that we do start to tax those who have big landowners, for example, moving towards a land value tax, which would actually start to tackle some of those things.
Can I answer too? Thanks. Great. So part of obviously the Green New Deal is really addressing some of those fundamental divides, because you can't build a green society that isn't just. You just can't do that. It's just, you know, some sort of eco-fascism perhaps, but you certainly can't do it if it's not just. And so we need to, so part of the home building thing is that we've proposed, which is over 100,000 new homes, which will be, you know, affordable rent. I mean, and the other thing about, sorry, let me, ninthly, right, I get on my soapbox here, for affordable, the government definition of affordable, which means 80% of market rents, is obviously has got to go. We just got to not stop using that completely. It used to be 30% of gross local wage, so that is what you measured affordability at. And if you don't have affordable homes, you cannot do this. So you need to have genuinely affordable homes that are really tied to local wages, and that's, you know, absolutely fundamental, not some fabric of, you know, some fabricated 80% of market rents. This is complete nonsense. So we have to really cut into addressing inequalities, absolutely have to, and housing is one aspect, but affordable warmth. You know, actually how we heat our homes, and having homes that don't need so much heating because we've invested public money in making homes affordable to heat. You actually, you know, we actually have to address this stuff, this inequalities, head on, and it's actually exactly how Cato has already mentioned it, you do it together. They both come together, you cannot do one without the other.
But when the problem's so large like this,
Can
and
we
we're so
not have
desperate...
a conversation between the two of you unless it's direct? No, I'm just saying to the questioner, I think we really have to move on to another question unless yours is directly connected.
Can we have a question from the woman in the green jumper here?
One of the causes of environmental devastation is war, and I wondered what your positions are on the arms trade. Is it acceptable that public money is spent on promoting the sale of British weapons? And what about the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia, as well as expert support to their war against Yemen and the total human and environmental devastation happening in Yemen? What are your views on this?
Who is going to take that? Paul?
Not only does the leader of the planet, the United States, wage war all over the planet, it's also weaponizing the financial system with the trade wars. And war is the opposite of peace. We should stop making war, and we should make love. Our global organisation was formed 20 years ago. It's called the Global Company of World Peace. Look it up on the internet. And we have technologies to deal with the invisible. We live in a connected world, and our tools are designed to stop war.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think it's outrageous that we supply so many arms as a country. I think there is some slightly suspect aspects of Labour Party policy which seek to retain some of the skills in our defence industry and speak about how proud we are of the manufacturing that goes alongside that. That's not a position I agree with.
I actually joined the Lib Dems to fight against the Iraq War. That was what first motivated me to get involved with the Lib Dems. And you may remember, I mean, at the time there was the defence spokesman for the Lib Dems was an MP, Paul Keach, who I actually then went on to work for, and I did some of the briefings on exactly that. How do we reduce our military-industrial complex? How do we look at changing the balance in terms of a more ethical foreign policy? And we did some really good briefings for which I got interrogated by the US Embassy at the time. So I completely agree with you, and I think that the UK is so embedded into this kind of global military-industrial complex, and it is going to be very hard to decouple ourselves. But I think the Lib Dems have a very clear policy, and we have done for many years, in terms of that more ethical, human rights-based approach to foreign policy, and that's something that I'd certainly be championing very strongly.
Green Party policy is very clearly to, first of all, stop subsidising arms sales. That's just like a no-brainer. And then just stop it, because we can't carry on doing that sort of industry. So we need to look at part of the Green New Deal is an economic deal where we're looking at new industries and things. And so it needs to be transformative, which means that we have to no longer earn our bread and butter and have whole communities whose livelihoods depend on making weapons. And there's is it a Robert Wyatt song, or is it Elvis Costello's song about shipbuilding? And so both are brilliant versions. Anyway, I don't know who wrote it. And we need to look at new industries for those places. The trouble is with areas which have a high concentration of one particular industry is that they need to have substitution. You can't just pull them out. We've all seen what happens when the coal mines all shut. We've seen what happens when steelworks shut. So we need to actually build alternatives alongside getting rid of the arms trade.
Thank you very much. Lots of arms up. I'm going to court on popularity by saying we can take two more. And I'd like to suggest, if Tanya agrees, we take two very insistent people. One of them is you, and the other is you. How long would you agree?
Can we have three?
A minute each.
Yeah,
that's your question and your answer. We must be out of this session by 9:30. Over to you.
Can I just make a quick statement, which makes sense? A question. It's about the recycling programme. Solar panels can be recycled and has the potential in by 2050 to become a $15 billion industry.
Hey.
So that's answer to the question. You can be recycled, and the question is about the green jobs that people talk about.
Yeah.
Sorry, the green jobs that people talk about. You wish something like that.
Right, 3 30-second questions, and out by 9:30.
No.
Yeah, this gentleman.
Hi, I've always thought the underlying assumption that economic growth was a no-brainer for the whole system that we live in. And it's not viable. And I'd like to know how you might propose addressing that's what seems obvious to us, but is not yet obvious to your companions in Parliament. How can we address the idea that economic growth is not workable?
One sentence communicative.
So one way that has been tested is this idea of a well-being budget, which I mentioned before. I know Bhutan has a happiness index, for example, so there are other ways of measuring the health of a nation. I think we need to move towards those other ways of mapping and measuring our own well-being.
Thank you, Ollie.
Love.
Thank you very
It's
much.
the concept of love. We need more love in our life, not money.
That's 3 sentences.
I agree with you, many other people aren't yet there, and I think part of what you can do is go slightly under the radar, and I think things like Labour Party policy and other parties' policy of having a 4-day week by 2030 is actually a really interesting way to start build the balance.
Johnny?
Well-being index too, yeah, we're there.
Thank you.
Last question from this woman here, please.
This is a question for the Labour candidate. Most of you have very, very good policies that are all very similar in the Green New Deal and care about the environment, but you can't work together because of this stupid first past the post system. When is Labour going to stand up for proportional representation so that people can all
What the manifesto says on this is that the Labour Party will commit to having a citizens' assembly on constitutional issues. Now, it doesn't specifically reference PR at all, and it's kind of under the guise of wider constitutional issues amongst the different countries of the United Kingdom. But I think that that citizens' assembly is a very good opportunity, and I have absolutely no doubt that 100 members of the public who sit down and think about constitutional issues in this country will come up with proportional representation as one of their recommendations.
Thank you. Clearly we could go on here for a very long time. Clearly also we're not going to. I'm sorry about that. It's been a fascinating evening, but we have to draw that part to a close now. For this next session, which is not going to take long, each of the panelists has 2 minutes to sum up what they want to say. Please get it in 2 minutes, otherwise I shall interrupt you, and then we shall close. Thank you. Shall we go in reverse order, starting with Paul and working that way?
Starting with Paul, that's good. Look, you know...
50 seconds.
You need to think differently about politics. The United Nations is a completely bankrupt institution. It's meeting in Madrid now. It's been meeting for 25 years and they can't make up their mind what to do about it. Nothing that we do in the UK is going to make the slightest bit of difference. We set up a global country of world peace 20 years ago. We're using consciousness. We're raising the quality of the consciousness on the planet. And I invite you to go to our website, the Global Country of World Peace, look at hundreds and thousands of scientists and look at the work in consciousness that we're doing.
Thank you, Paul.
This very definitely is a climate election, and if you care about the issues we've been discussing tonight, about communities that are easy to walk and cycle around, that are safe for our children, about the beautiful species we have in the wonderful landscape, about the risks of flooding, and you know, the Labour Party is going to take very radical, ambitious action quickly. We're going to properly resource that. We're going to make the polluter pay for that, and we're going to change the way the economy works. And the window of opportunity is fast closing, as Martin said at the very beginning with this presentation. This is a climate election, and I urge you to think very carefully what your vote is expressing.
Nicely done. Thank you all very much. I think we've had a fantastic discussion tonight, and I've really appreciated all the different thoughts and inputs that we've had tonight. For me, there are 3 final points I would make. I think we need to look at a fairer, more sustainable and more democratic future. We've talked about fairness, we've talked about the importance of tax reform, land value reform, we've talked about the importance of investing in our schools and communities. And then we need to look at how that is connected in terms of a just transition into the green economy. How do we build that economy of the future? How do we ensure that we have investment in our renewables? How do we make sure that our rail and our transport is clean and green and efficient? How do we make sure our housing is properly insulated so that we bring down our costs of our insulation? But finally, democratic. I think it's absolutely essential. I think that the last question that we had there about PR, I'd just like to mention, some of you will know this, the Liberal Party in the 1920s was talking about House of Lords reform, and that's been blocked for 100 years by the two biggest parties. And I think it's long, long overdue that we have that constitutional convention. We should look at House of Lords, we should look at PR, we should look at a written constitution so that we put our country back on a firmer footing for the future, for the 21st century. Thank you.
This is a climate election. It may be many other things too, but it is essentially a climate election. We have to start work now. The best time to vote Green was, of course, 20 years ago. In which case we might have maybe got some progress by now. But given that's the case, that's not the case, then if we don't vote Green now, when are we going to do that? So if not now, when?
That's the end of the formal meeting. I just want to say thank you to several people and organisations who played a large part in making this evening work. And I hope that you agree that it has worked in the way you wanted it to. First of all, thank you to the organisers, particularly Lewes Extinction Rebellion and Plastic Free Lewes, for the work they have done in arranging and holding this evening. Thank you too to our readers, Tanya and Katie, for battling on with the technical problems. And for making my job easier. I can't see much of you, but they can see, so that's why they were so vital about anything else. Thank you to the team that sorted out the questions. I was sitting on the fringes of that. They're not taking part yesterday, and they put a hell of a lot of work into it. So thank you for what you did. Last of all, thank you to you for being such a responsive, stimulating and helpful audience. I think it's been really good seen from here. I hope it has been worthwhile for you. One or two more things. First of all, there is an appeal for donations from the organisers, because obviously it costs something to put on something like this. You will find people with buckets out there. They would like to have something that doesn't make a noise when it goes into it. So please look out for them if you will. You will also find a table in the foyer which has further information. Maybe there is something there about disposing of solar panels. But anyway, you may well find information that is going to be useful to you. Final word from me. If you take one word away from tonight, I hope that word is urgency. It seems to me that is something that so often gets lost when we start talking about this, what we've been talking about tonight. Today, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said the point of no return is no longer over the horizon. But of course he's right, up to a point. And the point is that here in Lewes, or most other places in this country and most other places in Europe and North America, we've still got 10 years before the scientists say it is going to be reaching the point of no return. It's going to be at the point of no return. There are people tonight for whom the point of return has come or has passed. People who can no longer feed themselves and their families, who can no longer trust the Arctic ice to support them when they go hunting there, people who can no longer go and pursue their livings in the forests of the world for fear of falling foul of landlords and people who wish them ill. So the point of no return has been and gone. We are the lucky ones. And I hope you take that with us. Thank you.
Well said.
Oh.